Hello, everyone, and welcome to INE Live. I'm your host, Alexis Ahmed, and today I'll be giving you an introduction or a sneak peek, if you like, into my upcoming bootcamp on exploitation and post exploitation tactics. If this is your first time watching, welcome. We are streaming live across social media platforms right now, including LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that we want to hear from you. So if you want to get involved, we have two options for you. For the first, be sure to like, follow, or subscribe with the notifications turned on for whichever platform you're using so you can see the next time we go live. For the second, feel free to drop any questions you might have in chat with a Q in front, just so that we can track them, and the mods will grab them and send them my way so that I can answer them. Now, before we get started with this demo or presentation, I would like to inform you that you can register for the bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description section or the link posted in the chat, or by visiting INE's bootcamp page. The bootcamp will be running for 3 days, starting from tomorrow, which is the 22nd of June, all the way to the 24th of June, which is Friday, and the time will be from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. With that being said, let's get started by getting an introduction to the bootcamp, after which I'll be taking you through a quick lab demo or a scenario to showcase the kind of topics that I will be covering in the bootcamp. So I'm just going to switch over to my slides, and you'll be able to see that, and we'll be able to get started. So should be able to switch over to my slides now. There we are. All right. So to get started, this bootcamp is going to be focused on exploitation and post-exploitation tactics. All right. So who am I? You might be asking yourself. My name is Alexis Ahmed. I'm a senior penetration tester and red team at Hackexploit, and I'm also a red teamer here at INE, a red team instructor here at INE. If you want to get in touch with me, you can do so via my email, which is posted over here, or my Twitter or LinkedIn. With that being said, let's get an introduction to the bootcamp, right? So, exploitation and post-exploitation tactics. What am I covering? Well, firstly, I think it's important that we understand the importance of exploitation and post-exploitation in the context of a penetration test, right? So, exploitation and post-exploitation are an important part of the penetration testing life cycle and will ultimately define the overall success of a penetration test. That's quite telling, and I'm sure for those of you who are penetration testers, you are acutely aware of that, right? Now, this bootcamp is designed for beginners and more so intermediates that have some experience in pen testing or blue teaming, and I'll explain why. And who are looking to improve their knowledge of initial access and post exploitation techniques. Now, one thing that's very important to state here is that this bootcamp is going to be built on the MITRE ATT&CK framework and will cover various TTPs, that is, tactics, techniques, and procedures, in order to provide you with a better understanding of what tools adversary use and the techniques they employ during their campaigns. So the objective here is to sort of introduce you, within the bootcamp to the MITRE ATT&CK framework and to show you how you can use it either as a penetration tester or a red team or even someone who works on the defensive side of things, to essentially show you how to use that framework to get a better understanding of the initial access and post-exploitation TTPs that are used by adversaries. So who is this bootcamp for? Well, as I said, there's really three groups or types of individuals. Firstly, and not surprisingly, we have penetration testers, or generally speaking, information security professionals who are looking to get a better understanding of how to perform various exploitation and post-exploitation techniques. So, from the perspective of a penetration tester, you might want to learn about specific initial access or post-exploitation techniques. That's what this bootcamp is for. The second type of individual, or the second group of individuals, are of course red teamers, right? So you might be asking yourself, well, how does what benefit would a red teamer get from this? Well, if you're looking to improve your knowledge of adversarial TTPs for the purpose of adversary emulation, then this is going to be very useful. The reason for that is when you're a red teamer and when you're performing adversary emulation, it's very important to have an understanding of what techniques, and sub techniques adversaries utilize during their campaigns. And when performing adversary emulation, you'll typically be trying to model, a particular threat or a particular APT group. So having a tacit understanding of some of these, TTPs is very, very important. And then, of course, we have blue teamers. So again, you might be asking yourself the question, why would a blue teamer, find value in this particular bootcamp? Well, it's really designed for blue teamers who are looking to improve their understanding of of adversarial TTPs in order to better understand adversaries and the way they operate. So, from a blue team perspective, your job is to defend, infrastructure, and you can't really defend a company's or an organization's infrastructure if you don't understand what adversaries do, the techniques they employ, and the tools they use. So this bootcamp will also be covering that side of things. So we'll be talking a little bit about defense, the red team side, and also a little bit of purple teaming when it comes down to adversary emulation, and sort of how you can utilize this information to, for example, construct an adversary emulation plan. Right. So this bootcamp, let's actually take a look at the actual structure of the bootcamp. As I said, it's going to be a 3-day bootcamp, where on day one we're going to be focused primarily on initial access techniques, and this will not be limited to Windows or Linux. We're going to be covering them both. So to begin with, we'll be getting an understanding or an introduction to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and sort of understanding how it can be used by all fields within cybersecurity, whether it be red team, blue team, etc. And then we'll get started by taking a look at the various initial access techniques, right? So to start off, we'll be exploring, exploiting public-facing applications. I've just posted the technique ID there so that you can actually go ahead and check it out on the MITRE ATT&CK framework website. Exploiting public-facing applications essentially entails exploiting what's been made publicly available by a company or an organization. That's typically going to be a web application or a database or maybe even an API. We'll then move on to exploiting external remote services, right? So these are services that have been exposed by the company or organization. So, we'll be talking about services like SMB, not really focused on CVEs, but, tied to SMB, but more so inherent misconfigurations that can be exploited within services like SMB, FTP, SSH, etc. And then, of course, we're going to be exploring a technique, or rather sub technique, that is becoming increasingly important or increasingly popular with APT groups, and for a long time, obviously. And that, of course, is initial access via spear phishing. So we'll be taking a look at how to set up a phishing campaign. And of course, this will have all aspects explored, whether it be on the offensive side or on the defensive side. And then finally, we'll be covering initial access via a drive-by compromise. This is typically in the form of a web delivery payload. So we'll be exploring how they work, how web delivery payloads work, and how adversaries have implemented them within their campaigns to essentially, gain access to a target system or a target network. And from the blue team side, we'll be exploring what can be done to essentially, defend against these types of attacks. So that's day one. And then, of course, we're going to move on to day two, which will cover Windows post-exploitation tactics. So we'll start off by, taking a look at how to perform local enumeration on Windows. And we'll be exploring all types of solutions or frameworks. And we'll also be taking a look at how to do this manually, while also keeping in mind that during a typical penetration test or red team assessment, you will need to, be very cautious of what you do on a target system. So the objective there is to sort of enumerate as much information as possible from a target system to learn more about, what other systems are connected to it via maybe an internal network. Learn about all the users on the system, all the groups, any misconfigurations that can be exploited, either A, for the purpose of privilege escalation, or B, for the purpose of credential access. Once we've done that, we're going to be taking a look at privilege escalation techniques, right? So the examples or the techniques we'll be focusing on are going to be around valid accounts. So this will be this will really not be that specific to any particular sub technique, but we'll be exploring some of the weaknesses or misconfigurations that you'll typically find on Windows systems that could lead to the exposure of credentials for accounts already on the system, or valid accounts for that matter. And then, of course, we're going to take a look at the abuse elevation control mechanism, which essentially means, for those of you who are experienced, bypassing UAC in order to elevate your privileges, if that can be done. And that's more pertinent to more modern versions of Windows. And then, of course, we'll take a look at access token manipulation, or access token impersonation, if you will. We'll be taking a look at how to impersonate, privileged access tokens to elevate your privileges. We're then going to be exploring persistence, right, which is self-explanatory. Once you've gained access to a target system and you've elevated your privileges, you then need to establish persistent access to that system. And of course, this can be done beforehand, but the techniques that will be available to you if you set up persistence before elevating your privileges will be fairly minimal. So that's why we're doing it after. And the specific techniques we'll be exploring are essentially having an auto start execution of either a script or a binary that, when executed, will either provide you with a reverse shell or some form of command injection, or, remote code execution on the target system, so that you have, constant or persistent access on the target system. And of course, we'll take a look at how to set up a scheduled task or job, which again ties into the same thing. We want to make sure that we have persistent access to the target system. And then finally, we'll be taking a look at credential access, which also falls into, post-exploitation, or, it is a post-exploitation tactic. So we'll be taking a look at OS credential dumping on Windows. I'll be explaining the different types of hashes and how they can be cracked, how they can be dumped with a plethora of tools. And of course, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that we need to evade detection, or we need to be very quiet when doing this. So that's also something we'll be exploring. And then finally, on the last day, or on day 3, we'll be repeating the same process with minor differences on Linux. So again, we'll take a look at how to perform local enumeration on Linux. The objective here is, again, to enumerate as much information as possible from the system that you have just compromised. Once we've done that, we'll then move on to privilege escalation on Linux. And in this particular case, we'll be taking a look at some of the most popular techniques that we've seen been employed by APT groups. So one of them, or both of them, fall under abuse elevation control mechanism as a technique. But under the sub techniques, we have set UID and set GID binaries, which, if improperly configured, can allow an unprivileged user to elevate their privileges relatively easily. And then, of course, we have the same for sudo. So we'll be taking a look at how to sort of exploit misconfigurations or inherent vulnerabilities within sudo to elevate our privileges. And then, of course, we'll move on to persistence. So we'll take a look at scheduled tasks, which more specifically we'll be exploring cron. So we'll take a look at how to set up persistent access to a Linux box by setting up a cron job that then does something that an attacker would typically do. That could either be connect to a listener, or to execute a particular command, or a particular piece of code. And then, of course, we have the web shell. The web shell sub technique, which falls under server software component. Web shells are very, very common and very popular, especially right now amongst some of the newer APT groups, but also amongst some of the older veteran APT groups. And that's the example that we'll be exploring today. We'll be taking a look at how we can utilize a web shell to establish persistent access on a Linux target. And of course, that is a sub technique. And then finally, and most importantly, we're going to be exploring lateral movement as a post-exploitation tactic, and that is going to essentially involve pivoting and port forwarding through or via the exploitation of remote services on the system that you'd like to pivot to. So again, it's fairly simple to understand. We gain access to a target system, and then we want to move laterally through the target network. And we're going to be exploring the actual technique of exploiting a remote service on a system that we would like to exploit or gain access to via the system that we've already exploited, also known as pivoting. With that being said, before we get started with the next phase, let me take a look at some of your questions so that I can try and answer them. So there we are. Does the bootcamp have some testing environment for practice? That's by Bodan. Yes, it does. The bootcamp will be recorded. So after the bootcamp is concluded, you'll have access to the videos or the recorded version of the bootcamp in addition to the labs that were used, so that you can actually go ahead and follow through with the techniques that have been highlighted. Naveen Kumar, is this bootcamp paid or free? The bootcamp is behind an INE subscription, or you have the ability to buy access to it at a one-off cost. Let's see if we can answer any more questions. It doesn't look like we have any more, so I think we can proceed with the next phase of this presentation. So, as a practical demo, to sort of give you an idea as to what we'll be covering or the type of content we'll be covering, let's take a look at one of the sub techniques that I really wanted to showcase, and that is, of course, persistence via a web shell. And in order to do this, what we need to do firstly is we need to get an understanding of what a web shell is and where it's been used or by whom it's been used with regards to APT groups. So a web shell is essentially a web script that is hosted on a web server for the purpose of executing commands, also known as command injection. Now, believe it or not, web shells were once utilized legitimately by system administrators, by developers, etc. However, not surprisingly, they were easily weaponized by adversaries, right? Because if you think of it, a web shell allows you to execute remote code on a web server. Now that is very useful for developers or for system administrators. However, the issue with that is if anyone gains access to that particular web shell, maybe an adversary, then you can pretty much guess what they're going to use that type of access to do. So it actually became quite a popular technique or sub technique rather, that was employed by adversaries, primarily because it's very clandestine, and you'll actually see why. If no proper security mechanisms are put in place or no proper logging of the web server and all requests is put in place, a web shell can be a very, very good or very effective way of maintaining persistent access to a target server. All right. So, adversaries will typically backdoor web servers or really any types of servers with web shells to establish persistent access to systems. An example of this is APT32 and APT38. APT38 is Lazarus, thus the North Korean APT group, and APT32 is an APT group from Vietnam that targeted financial institutions around the world. What they did, or what both of them did, was essentially, target specific web servers being used by these financial institutions, preferably ones that were not behind any type of security mechanism or any type of security, cybersecurity infrastructure, and they also further narrowed down their choices to the ones that were not actively being interacted with by system administrators, and essentially employed backdoors in them in the form of web shells, and essentially maintain persistent access to all of the servers that they had compromised. All right, so as I've said, web shells provide adversaries with clandestine persistent access to compromised systems, and are, generally speaking, very difficult to detect if no proper logging or security mechanisms are in place. Now, for the example that I'll be showing you, we're going to be taking a look at a very, very basic web shell. Of course, when you talk about APT groups and the types of defense evasion techniques or tools that they use, they'll typically employ a backdoor or a rootkit, a very low-lying rootkit, if you will. There are also some rootkits that work or have been configured to work as Apache modules, so they can be really clandestine and can be very difficult to spot, especially if the target server is not being actively protected and doesn't have any of its logs being shipped for analysis. Because if that's being done, then a web shell can be identified really quickly based on the arguments that are being supplied to it in the form of GET requests. With that being said, Before I start up the lab environment, I'm just going to try and answer a couple of questions here. And if you have any, you can post them now. And I'll try and answer them before we actually get started. All right, doesn't look like we have any questions. So I'm just going to start up the lab environment, and then I'll share my screen. And we can take a look at how we can utilize a very basic web shell um, to maintain persistent access to a Linux server or a Linux target. Now, again, one thing that is also very important is, that this is not really platform specific. Web shells can be employed, on both Windows Server as well as Linux servers. It really, it really doesn't. It really doesn't matter what type of operating system you have gained access to. So let me just open up the lab here, and I should be able to share my screen shortly. So let me just make sure that is set up. So there we are. And there we go. All right. Looks like we have a question from Bodan Lukin. What about persistence where web software is not present? That's also something that we'll be exploring within the bootcamp itself. So, we'll be exploring different types of persistence techniques, and when they can be employed based on what type of defenses are present, as well as the target's configuration. All right, so I think we're ready to go with the actual lab itself. So if you can see my screen, I think we're good to go. In this particular lab, we are starting off from a point of whereby we're already assuming that the target system has been compromised and we have some form of access to it. In this case, the type of access that we have to the target is via SSH. So I'm just going to open up, I'm just going to type in ifconfig so I can identify the target IP here. So I'll just copy the IP associated with the interface Ethernet 1, and I'll just SSH into the target box. So we're assuming we've already obtained these credentials. So I'll just paste that in there, and the target IP is the third IP within the subnet. So there we go. And I'll just type in the password. And there we are. So we have access to the target system called victim1 as the user student. We currently have unprivileged access, which means we don't have any root privileges or we're not part of the sudo group, which is perfectly fine. This technique will work just fine if we can make changes to the directory where the actual web application is being hosted. So to begin with, let's perform some basic enumeration just to highlight, what exactly we're going to do. So you can see we're running the Linux kernel 5.4.0, and if I display that, you can see it's Ubuntu 18.04.3, and within the student's home directory, we have a specific binary here that we will actually will come in handy in a few seconds, but it'll actually show you how important persistence is, primarily if your initial access vector is actually blocked, or later down the line is actually patched if you exploited the target system through a vulnerability. If you lose that initial access vector, then the actual web shell can be another way of getting back into the system or maintaining persistent access. So before we start doing any of that, let's get an understanding of what web server is running on this particular system. So if I just display a list of all the processes, we can see that we have an Nginx worker process here. And that is owned by the service account www data, which makes sense. And by default, whenever you're dealing with Nginx or Apache, the default directory where the actual web application or website is stored is going to be under var, www, and HTML. So you can see within that particular directory, we have the default boilerplate index file here. So that's index nginx debian.html. So you can see that this is owned by the root user, but we can make changes to this. In order, before we actually do that, let's verify that we can. So var www, let's just take a look at the permissions here. So yeah, it looks like everyone on the system can read and write, changes or make changes to this particular directory and all uh, the the files within that directory, and we can also execute files or binaries. So in order to set up the web shell, we're going to be setting up a fairly simple web shell with PHP. That's because this is a LAMP stack. If we were on Windows or we had exploited a Windows system, then we would have generated an ASP, an ASP web shell, and that would typically fall under the resource development tactic within the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So I'll just navigate into the var html directory here. And what I'll do here is let me open up, I'll just say Vim, and I'll call it, I can call it whatever I want. Now, when performing this, in a real world environment, you want to make sure that the name isn't indicative of the function, right? So the worst thing that you could do, and this is something that will be easily detected, is to call it reverse shell or web shell. So ideally, you'd like to give it a name that fits within the naming structure of the web application. Now, in this case, we don't have a web application. It's just a vanilla Nginx server, right? And we don't have any web applications or any files being hosted. So for the purpose of simplicity, we'll just call it shell.php, right? And as I said, we're going to be creating a very simple one. So we can just open up the PHP tags here, and we're going to create a variable called output, and then we're going to utilize the PHP shell exec function. So shell exec, and then we're going to specify the get variable, which is used to store the data that is obtained from a request. So um, uh, we can actually just specify directly. So we'll say get. So that is the get variable. That's a global variable. And then we can specify the parameter to use. And this will tie into the command injection. This will make sense when we'll be performing it. But typically you'll see, most basic web shells will use the parameters CMD, and then you can specify the value that you would like to be processed or executed by the web shell. So we'll just say CMD in this case. Of course, that can be changed based on your own requirements. And what we can do now is let's specify that we want to output or echo the output produced by the actual execution of the command that will be passing through in the form of a GET request. So we'll say echo output. That's the output variable that we had created, and we can then close the PHP tag like so. So that looks okay, and we can then write and quit. All right, so this shell.php file is accessible on the web server. And what we can do now is let's navigate back to the directory of the home directory of the student user. And remember that we have that wait file here, the wait binary. If we remove it, what it's going to do is it's going to simulate a scenario where your access to the target system via the initial access vector that you had used is actually patched or is terminated. So if I just say remove wait, and I give that, there we are, a couple of seconds, you can see the connection is closed. And if we try and SSH into that box again via the credentials that we had obtained, you can see that we'll not be able to authenticate successfully. So even though I've provided the correct password, that's not going to work. So given the fact that this lab environment doesn't provide you with a GUI interface, how do we test this web shell? This is a very simple command injection web shell where you can pass in the commands that you'd like to execute through the actual parameter value. So an example of this, if we wanted to execute some commands on the system, is we could use a tool like curl and make a GET request. Before I do that, let me just make sure I identify the target IP, because again, this is not static. So I'm just going to copy that value there, and we can say curl, and we're making a request. So HTTP, and I can then paste in the value there. I'm going to change that to a 3 because that's the actual target IP, and the name of the file is shell.php. And then we specify the name of the parameter that we had specified within the web shell, which in this case is CMD. And then we can execute whatever command that we want on the target system. So an example of this would be, who am I? I'll just close the quotes there. So if I hit enter, you can see it's executed successfully on the web server, and because it's executed by the web server, it's going to inherit the actual execution of this command will fall under the privileges of the www data service account, which is a non-privileged account. But again, this means that you still have access to the target system. So let's try and run a couple of other commands here just to show you how this works, and then I'll show you, I'll show you another tool that attackers would typically use to obtain some form of a shell or a pseudo shell, pseudo with a P. So if I type in ID, you can see that displays the ID data there. And then, of course, if there is some form of filtering by a web application firewall, then of course these types of parameters, especially the keyword CMD, is something that's going to be blocked. So as I said, be very cognizant of the fact that all of the or the way you design the web shell needs to actually be done in a way to sort of evade detections by even some of the most simplistic web application firewalls like mod security. So another example, as I said, is if we say, for example, let's say list the home directory and then student. Let's see if that's executed correctly. You can see we have the flag there, and then of course we can cat the content of the flag. Now, this is all well and good, or it's really there's nothing special here. As I said, another tool that attackers would typically use once they have even if it's a very rudimentary web shell, is they would typically use a tool like comics whenever they wanted to get some form of a shell on the target system. So comics is an command injection tool. As you can see here, this is an automated all-in-one operating system command injection and exploitation tool. And it essentially allows you, most importantly, to identify command injection vulnerabilities in websites. But in our case, we're already looking at it, or we're going to be using it from the perspective of an adversary who has already gained initial access to a target system. So in order to use it, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of this here, and I'll just modify my previous command with curl, and we can say comics. And at the moment, we don't need to specify any special parameters. We specify the URL flag. And let me just clear my screen so you can see that much better. And what will happen when I hit enter is it's going to begin the wizard, the comics wizard. There we are. So it's going to check the connection to the target URL. It's going to ask me whether I recognize the server's operating system. In this case, I know it's a Unix-based operating system, or Unix-like in the case of Linux. There we are. As you can see, it's going to set the get parameter CMD for tests. It's then going to test the classic command injection technique via results, and the get parameter CMD seems injectable. So we get a payload, and then it asks you right over here if we want a pseudo terminal shell. So if I hit yes, it's going to provide me with a very basic web shell, if you will, through my terminal. And this is all being executed through the web server. So, for example, I can, again, just type in the commands I typed in previously, and you can see it takes a couple of seconds to actually, produce the output. That's because the actual requests are being sent through the web server in the form of GET requests. So, for example, we can head over into home student, and there we are. You can see, because it's a pseudo shell, we can't really navigate to particular directories because this is not really a terminal session. So ideally, what we would need to do is say home student, and we can then say flag.txt. And that should display the flag there. So yeah, these are the types of techniques that we'll be exploring. Of course, we'll be exploring them in a bit more depth. However, for the purpose of this presentation, and with the fact that we have to be cognizant of the time, that's one of the techniques that I wanted to highlight. And with that being said, this is where I'm sort of going to conclude the presentation. So I'm going to now, turn over to your questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them now so that I can answer them. So I will try and turn over to the questions here. There we are. So let me see if we have any new questions. So we have a question from Boden Lukin. Are you considering post requests instead of get requests? I think this might reduce the detection rate since all get requests will be seen in the web server logs. Yep, that's true. As I said, these are things that we'll be exploring. In the bootcamp, we'll be exploring different scenarios and when to actually use one technique over the other. In this case, primarily because there wasn't any logging in place, we could easily just use get requests. But as I said, in infrastructure or on servers that have logging, then we would typically need to revert to a much more clandestine web shell. And of course, access being made to the target system via that web shell will need to be limited, because if too much traffic is going to a particular page or a particular file with specific parameters and values and their consequent values, then that's also suspicious. We have a question from DOS. This bootcamp also help. Can this bootcamp also help on AD privilege escalation? Yeah, we'll be exploring a couple of AD techniques, not really tied to privilege escalation, but they can be applied in an Active Directory environment. We'll probably be covering Active Directory within its own bootcamp, primarily because that's a much more specialized topic. So, yeah. If you have any more questions, I don't see anything else here. But yeah, feel free to ask any questions and I'll be sure to answer them. All right. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. So I think this is where I'm going to wrap up the stream for today. Thank you very, very much for watching. If you missed it live, you can look for the replay across our social channels and on the INE website. Just a quick reminder, we'll be live again next week on Tuesday, June the 28th, and we look forward to hearing from you again. Be sure to like, follow, or subscribe on your choice of social platform with notifications turned on so that we can stay, or so that you can stay in the loop for details on our next stream and hear about our community giveaways. As always, bring your questions next week. We'll see you next time. And until then, have a great week. Bye.